everyone. Good to be back here on cozy.tv. Today, I'm joined with someone that I admire quite deeply. I think he's a very I think he's a very profound thinker. I think he's someone who brings a lot to the table in terms of not only defending the faith, but I think being open and honest about what areas of the faith that we really have to, I think, double our efforts in, and in terms of trying to uh, address some of the uh, most difficult dimensions of the faith to not only defend but also, I think, understand. Um, and his name is Erick Ybarra. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work. He's appeared all over the place throughout the you know Catholic internet landscape. He's appeared on Reason and Theology. Uh, he has his own channel. I think it's called Classical Christian Thought. Um, he's also authored books. He just came out with a book on the papacy, uh, and he can update me on his uh, what his list of books that he's written. In fact, what that list is indeed composed of. But I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work. I'm a great admirer of what he does. So, Eric, I just want to kind of welcome you uh, on the stream. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. I really appreciate you having me here. I think it's going to be real fun. And I do have my own channel. Um, it kind of manifests a few things about me, though. I think I've been very spoiled when it comes to like you mentioned, the Catholic internet landscape. I've always relied on other people to do all the editing and the video recording and things like that. So if you go to my channel, I have a measly like 11 videos or something like that. Um, and it's slowly growing. I can't always I want to participate more into it, but and by the way, it's called Classical Christian Thought, like you said, and I I didn't know what else to call it because when I had started Reason in Theology with Michael Lofton, I think he was the one who said Reason in Theology, and I was like, yeah, that sounds perfect. But when I wanted to start my own little thing, I couldn't think of anything better than Reason in Theology either. But I can't just call another channel Reason in Theology, and I also didn't want to call it something that was basically like classical theism because I know there's already we already have you as the famous classical
Yeah,
theist, and then we
there's
have
already some guy has that name.
oh yeah, and then there's classical theism, I think, another
Yeah.
guy. So I just I it probably looks like I ripped it off of you, but I didn't
No,
know what
no,
else to
no.
call it.
Well, I
Classical
think
Christian thought is what it was.
I think it fits you because I think you're very well known for um, very specifically uh, theological issues.
Right,
You
right,
know, so I think it makes kind of sense that you didn't call yourself classical theism. Uh, 'Cause that's kind
right.
of more pertaining to
More,
like
yeah,
metaphysics, natural theology, which I know
right.
you have spoken of.
Yeah, we touch
Yeah,
on it, but
yeah,
it's not. I've touched on it, but it's definitely not like something that I've got far too much. Like a landscape is too wide to go that deep
yeah,
into one thing. Yeah, so
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's some problem that I've kind of had. I feel like I pigeonholed myself into one kind of category, but in fact, I try to talk about all sorts of other things. But that's neither here nor there. Um, yeah, I just kind of wanted to. I have a number of questions that I've wanted to kind of pose to you, um, and I think the first one that I might want to pick your brain on a bit, and it's something that I think suits you because, like I said introducing you. I think you are unique in that you're quite open and honest about the areas of Catholicism that one could even say are its main vulnerabilities, not intrinsic vulnerabilities, as if to say that the faith is somehow intrinsically weak, or there's some deficiency in the Catholic faith itself. It's not that, but it's more areas in which um, perhaps our critics or our opponents uh, have, we could say, the easiest task ahead of them in at least attempting to undermine the credibility of the faith, if I can put it that way. So I guess
Right.
I was just going to ask you, like, what are the three? If you could like narrow it down to three, what are three of those, we could say, vulnerabilities? Like three of, I would say, that are uh, that best fit that category, and how would you kind of what are some of the ways in which you address them? If that's too broad
Hmm.
of a question, I can narrow it down more.
No, yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, I've been, I this is something that people get annoyed with me about too.
I noticed that.
So some people appreciate it, some people find it annoying, and I think what it is that it hits people differently based upon their stance or their disposition. When somebody is maybe they've just read, Stephen Ray's book on the Pope, right?
Yeah.
And it's the only book they've read on the subject, and they think the case is just so strong
Right.
for Catholicism. It's like, how could anybody debate this? This is so clear. And then they find somebody who's been studying these or perhaps wrote a book about the subject, and he's not as as I don't know how to describe this, but it's not as as simple. Yeah, there's just no way any obvious thinker would know that this is the truth. It gets annoying because it's like, well, wait a minute, this is what I've gathered from my own reading, and I'm seeing this. And then other people who I think find it they find it like as a breath of fresh air are people who've read more than Stephen Ray's book on the papacy, and they've been interacting with people who aren't Catholic. And they've been interacting with people who may have studied, very deeply
Hmm.
on the points of contention, and they're scared that Catholicism is just wrong. And then they come across somebody who's thought about these things, and can speak to them, but doesn't necessarily have to conclude that Catholicism is false. But we could actually still defend the faith quite brilliantly, but it's going to take a little bit more work. And but when it comes to the issues about Catholicism that where we could be susceptible to criticism, I think is that you know especially in today's Catholic apologetic sphere, um, we we come with this claim that the Catholic Church is the one true church, right?
Hmm.
And the corollary of that is every other claimant is false. And we also say that our church is the unchanging church of history, and this is kind of exactly what Newman, or Carl, Saint John Henry Newman, before he converted to Catholicism in 1845,
Hmm.
as an Anglican writer, he was wrestling with. He saw Saint Vincent de Lérins
Hmm.
in his commonitorium as kind of like uh, a noose for Catholicism, because St. Vincent says that is Catholic, which has been believed always by everyone in all
Right.
places.
The Vincentian
And so,
canon, as it's called. Yeah.
it's the Vincentian canon. And so early Newman, pre-Catholic Anglican Newman, the fiery anti-Catholic, we could even say, because sometimes he expressed himself that way. He saw the Vincent canon to be um, sort of like the death blow to
Right.
Catholicism, because it's very clear that the Church of the fourth century is different than the Church of the 12th century. That's just apparent. And so all you got to do is just basically show that they're different, you know, and that's it, you know. So we're going to have to go with trying to figure out what is Catholic through sifting through all these documents and everything. And his, like, I've actually read some of his Anglican works when he was an Anglican against Catholicism, and they're stronger than any Orthodox or contemporary Anglican I've read against Catholicism. I mean, you got to be careful. Like, when you read his stuff before he converted, you got to be careful, because it could almost shake your faith a little bit about how well he's arguing. So I think that, you know, this is one of the issues that Catholicism is facing, or has faced, rather. How dare I say is facing? This is something we've always had to deal with since the Protestant reforms, especially, is the issue of historical discontinuity.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's a big issue. Protestants love to belabor the point. Orthodox think that they could also belabor the point. And so this is a challenge.
It is one of those issues, it seems to me, that I think it's the key issue, the key distinguishing issue that makes Catholicism falsifiable. I mean, it's one of those things that, like, if you can go back and prove, like, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's a true contradiction between some definitive teaching and another definitive teaching throughout history, then that would, by itself, disprove the Catholic claims, right?
Yeah, yeah, and also, as we continue through the centuries, the Catholic Church has certain methods to try and demonstrate continuity,
Yeah.
and sometimes the methodology is different. So, for example, you know, if you were to read the writings of, you know, the 17th century Gallican, he was a Catholic, so he was a Gallican before Gallicanism was,
Right.
you know, officially condemned. But Jacques Bossuet, he taught that everything that the Catholics taught in the 16th century at the Council of Trent, for example, is what was taught explicitly by the apostles. So for him, his understanding of development was very different than some of his peers of the day. But if you read Catholic apologetical works like Bossuet and others within that era they were answering the Protestants, you could see that Catholics were thinking that if you just read the Bible and the early church fathers, you're going to see the Catholic Church. You're going to see the Catholic Church. They didn't really think that they would have to craft something like doctrinal development. You know, as we get closer to the 18th century, 19th century, you see more theologians retrieving these ideas, because they're not new. You already have them, like, scattered throughout different thinkers in the first millennium, for goodness sake. But you start to see more of a shift in trying to show continuity by way of doctrinal development. And it kind of comes with the advancement of patristic sources, because the Protestants, you know, the Lutheran scholastics, the the era of biblical criticism, higher criticism, text criticism, historicism. One of the crowning figures of this time in the last part of the 19th century is Dollinger,
Hmm.
Ignaz von Dollinger. They're coming to like translate works, read works from the past, and with new questions like, all right, is Catholicism really rooted in history? And what they're finding is they're finding they're finding clashes, collisions, uh, problems that Catholics have just been kind of overlooking. For like used to be, where a classic example would be Cyprian of Carthage,
Yeah.
and sometimes even to this day, you'll hear a Catholic citing
Yeah.
Cyprian of Carthage on the unity of the church.
Yeah. Which is a problem.
um,
It's
and
one of those things that you see like just Cyprian of Carthage quotes, and you're like, that might do a little more harm than good. You know?
yes, it's but if like Saint Robert Bellarmine, as much as I love Saint Robert Bellarmine, he'll quote Cyprian as if Cyprian was basically teaching the papacy. And to be fair to him, he does seem to recognize that there was a clash at the end of Cyprian's life, and I'm sure he does well to explain,
Yeah.
himself. But initially, he kind of thinks that there's something to show for there, and what you start to see guys like Dollinger point out is, and some of the Anglicans that were disputing with Newman, for example, like Edward Pusey or uh, uh, Mossert and other guys in the Anglican in the Oxford movement that were
Mhm.
just as highly intellectual as Newman. They were going into the patristics and finding all kinds of problems that Catholics need to deal with, and that is a big challenge. I think it's not something that we can just overlook. And what I think is the biggest challenge is uh, just throwing down the card of doctrinal development is not going to cut it anymore, because uh, there has to be some sort of a demonstration that there is continuity rather than development
Yeah.
of doctrine only, because doctrinal development then becomes another phrase for, yes, there's a gap, there's a difference. They didn't believe what we believe now, but we've got this uh, lasso that we could throw to the fourth century and pull it to ourselves by saying doctrinal development.
Yeah. I see a strong danger with treating doctrinal development too elastically is that you can kind of, in a way, undermine the very uh, integrity of theological orthodoxy itself. Because if you expand doctrinal development too much to try to solve some problem of historical discontinuity, what you might end up doing is adopting a view of doctrinal development that could open the door for allowing all kinds of ways in which the faith could be undermined right now, here and now. So, like, if we take a view of doctrinal development that is too elastic or too expansive, what's to say that what the German bishops are advancing couldn't be like a legitimate form of doctrinal
Exactly.
development? You really want to be careful in making sure that you're not just appealing to doctrinal development too hastily to solve some problem, when in reality you could be opening the door for uh, logical consequences that are really quite that would be very lamentable. So how would you balance that out? Like, how would you define legitimate doctrinal development versus illegitimate doctrinal development in light of clearing up some of these areas of historical discontinuity? Like, how do we get at solving those problems while not opening the door for a view of doctrinal development that would kind of undermine orthodoxy itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. What it appears to be, like what you're alluding to here, is imagine you're playing a chess game, and hopefully most of your listeners are familiar with the rules of the game. But if your king's about to be, you know, open to checkmate, being put into checkmate, you what you do is maybe you have two or three moves in order to protect your king. So you're going to have to choose one of those three, right?
Yeah.
Well, so sometimes what it looks like is we're clearly en route towards a checkmate against Catholicism. But we have to come up with one of these moves, whether it's adjusting our bishop in place or moving the king himself, in order to avoid being put into checkmate.
Anonymous sent
So it
$3
looks
if the
like
church starts ordaining women as priests,
our
as many
defense
bishops advocate for.
is
Would that
engineered.
invalidate the church as the one and only holy Catholic
I
and
hear
Apostolic
something in the
Church and
background.
body of
Is that-
Christ?
is that
it's
like
just
the-
a,
Or is there a way to explain the change as consistent with dogma?
Yeah, so it's just a super chat. The gentleman is asking if the church decided to ordain women, would that undermine the legitimacy of Catholic claims? I mean, I think it certainly would. I mean, but
Right.
But I also have faith that wouldn't happen. And, but yeah, you can continue with what you're saying. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem at all. Yeah. So, here's I'll give you an example. The ex cathedra condition for papal infallibility. Okay, this is what it looks like to critical thinkers that have been studying the issues. They clearly see the claims of indefectibility and infallibility in the first millennium. The church fathers of East and West. But then there's this right around Vatican I. You had really good historical theologians like Dollinger. You had another guy, I can't remember his name, but he's the one who inspired the secretary of the First Vatican Council to write a small little rebuttal called True and False Infallibility. And I can't remember the secretary's name now off the top of my head, but these guys were going back, especially to like the 13th century, where popes were saying that they're basically rulers of the whole world because of their possession of the keys of the kingdom.
Yeah.
So not just the doctrinal realm, but basically everything in the known planet is theirs because of the keys of the kingdom, temporal or in matters related to the church. And so they were going to all these, statements from different popes throughout these times. They, especially like Unum Sanctum. Not just, people famously go to that one because of the exclusivity of the church, but there's actually some other challenging bits about temporal power in that, text. And what you start to see are people saying, it actually gained traction for centuries, but now it became something like a matter of necessity to bring up, is that, well, the Pope can err as a private person, but when he speaks ex cathedra, then he's not capable of erring. And so what that sounds like is, well, you realize you're about to be checkmated because we've got all these statements from popes in the past that perhaps are not false, but they certainly contradict with each other. And so forget about whether what they're saying is true or false. Let's just look at internal coherence.
Right.
And if it doesn't pass internal coherence, we don't even need to look at whether what they're saying is true or false. It could be true in one instance, it could be false in another. All we need to find is a contradiction. And so you start to see this, like this. Some authors are emphasizing ex cathedra. For some people, it's really broad. It's just when the Pope teaches the whole church. And for others, it's not just when he teaches the whole church. It's when he teaches the whole church in a certain way.
Yeah.
And so here we're like we're like tuning this thing down. And potentially today we have a working definition since 1871.
Yeah.
But I could imagine, like, if 100 years from now, we collect statements from Pope Francis, statements from Pope Francis II, and all these statements, and
Not
then
ready for Francis II. I'm sorry.
yeah, I know. I have to quickly think of something else in order to not lament here, but I could imagine 100 years from now, Catholic apologists or theologians now saying, "Well, ex cathedra is the condition." But now we know that you have to make an explicit appeal to the Apostle Peter, and you have to have the word apostle in there. So only when the Pope teaches, when he makes an explicit appeal to the Apostle Peter as the grounds of his authority, then he's infallible. So in other words, if your listeners and yourself are following me here, there's this kind of like, we see the checkmate coming, but then we engineer
we have to
ways
tweak it in order to
tweak it, refine it, and all these things, and then claim continuity.
Now, I think like that. I definitely see what you're saying there. I will say, it seems to me that we might be overlooking that. In the example you gave, we may be overlooking the mediating category of magisterial teaching between private opinion and infallible teaching,
Right.
namely the non-definitive magisterium. And
Right.
I guess I was just kind of wondering where you fall on that. Like, do you believe that even the non-definitive magisterium is protected by a charism of safety?
Yeah. So before I get to that, I just want to quickly finish the whole question about how I would, make a case for doctrinal, what kind of development. What I would say in brief is that we can't do the, like Newman understood. We can't just pull a rabbit out of the hat. This is just it's new. The papacy believes it, teaches it, that settles it. We move on. I don't think we can do that. I think that that's basically a surrender from the field of debate. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. But I would say that one of the things we need to recognize is that not every single thing in history is considerable. Not every single person who objected to a pope, for example, is significant evidence.
Right.
Like in the whole episode with Saint Cyprian, for example, Protestants love to go to this.
Yeah. It's true.
Or Orthodox love to go to it.
Yeah.
But we see that Cyprian's view was also contradicted by Pope Stephen's view. And so you have two equally antique views right now.
Right.
Excuse me. So what it looks like when an Orthodox appeals to Cyprian is that Cyprian's view was the superior one, was the only antique one, and that what we're trying to sell people today about the papacy is what came later. But if you study the history close enough, what you're going to find, and this is one of the things we need as Catholics to point out, is that there may have been a competition, but follow the competition to its conclusion. How did it end?
Right.
And so you've got Pope Stephen, for those who are not familiar, was the Pope during the time of Saint Cyprian. Pope Stephen was making claims to make enforcements in Asia and in Africa on the issue of baptism, which is a clear claim to jurisdiction foreign the Italian peninsula. And so you have papal claims there. This is something that even Orthodox scholars admit. So it's not like Cyprian is the dream team and Stephen just doesn't get listened to. Imagine if we had the corpus of Stephen and all his letters.
Right. I mean, that's just it. Right. I mean, it seems to me that what we're kind of being asked to do is to prove something that we've never really claimed, which is that everything that we believe had unanimous consent among all the fathers. And
or even all writers, even Christian like some people point out Tertullian, Origen, non-saints, they point to a lot of different sources to try and disprove Catholicism. But in the whole Cyprian and Stephen case, you see a competition, and then Cyprian's view completely gets washed up by the shore.
Yeah.
Not even the Greeks take up his position. They recognize that there's that Rome is in a position of primacy, and that certain things can't be legislated without his approval.
Right.
The Greek bishops, the Greek saints end up believing that the local church cannot be supreme.
Yeah.
That's one thing that Cyprian ended up making little papacies in each church with the bishop. And so you start to see that the view of papal primacy that has jurisdiction in anywhere in the church actually survived, whereas Cyprian's view did not. And so, that has to be looked at, and you have to ask yourself, okay, if Christ's promise is true, that the gates of hell would never prevail against it, then excuse me, then what endured from the conflict is it has more probability of reflecting what the intention of Christ was.
Right. I can see what you're saying there, because what endures is essentially what ends up persevering in spite of attack, or in spite of it being undermined. And it seems to me that is the precise dynamic that would play out in the gates of hell not prevailing against the church. It's the survival of the deposit of faith through the various stages in which that deposit has been undermined in various ways. And it just seems to me it's this view that is tries to get us to concede our ground simply upon recognizing that there were patristic opponents to Catholic claims. It sort of misses the whole point of the various declarations of the church throughout history that have established Catholic claims. The point of those declarations was precisely to reach a clarification in spite of controversy. So the fact that we have these more refined articulations of Catholic dogma throughout the centuries, that presupposes the fact that these claims persevered in spite of controversy all throughout the ages. Like, we, of course, we recognize that many fathers opposed our understanding of these various points of doctrine, but like you said, it's we really have to look at, okay, yes, these points of doctrine were opposed by various fathers, but what historical forces led to one view winning out and the other not?
Exactly, and just as a proof of that is just fast forward from Cyprian 250 to the Council of Ephesus 431. That's what 200 and 250, 350, 450. That's like 180 years later. Just 180 years later, you have the Council of Ephesus reading out papal claims from Pope Celestine, and they all acclaim it.
Yeah.
So that's what there was 220 bishops at the Council of Ephesus. So you have Saint Cyprian, who we all love Saint Cyprian. We venerate Saint Cyprian. We applaud him for his heroic martyrdom. He ran the race. He finished it well. But he was still one bishop who was largely left to himself in the matter. And then just 180 years later, the one episcopate that Cyprian said could not err, right? Because nobody believes that Cyprian thought that the episcopate could err as a whole. Well, at the Council of Ephesus, you've got the entire Catholic episcopate accepting the papal claims. So by this point, there had been a graduation from competitive claims to St. Peter's role, the Roman pontiff's role, and things like that. But by the time, just 180 years later, it's a given. It's granted. It's not even a matter of dispute anymore. Of course, there's more disputes to come.
Right. Yeah.
But we just apply the same rules. And so I think development has to, you've got to be able to find a way to show the continuity and to show how the Catholic continuity is the only way that keeps the original staying on 2 feet.
Okay. You'd expand on that a little bit on the original.
Yes. So, for example, Cyprian thought the church was one and undivided, right? So, if we fast forward from Cyprian 5 centuries later, in order for Cyprianic ecclesiology to stay what it was, we have to have visible unity. But it just so happens in the 6th, 7th century, everybody understands the unity of the church to be circling around the Roman pontiff as the heir of St. Peter.
Right.
So in order for Cyprian's basic dogma to survive is for us to accept the very mechanism which brought that to continue, which is the primacy of the apostolic see. So here's the original thing. So Saint Cyprian definitely towards the end of his life is practically denying that the Pope has powers to have jurisdiction in the African church. Let's face it. He at one point he thought the Pope could have jurisdiction in Arles and other areas in the West. He came to view that this matter was so important that the Pope had no rights to touch it. Well, that contradicts Vatican I, ladies and gentlemen. That definitely contradicts Vatican I. But Cyprian's larger dogma that the episcopate is one, the church is one and undivided, just like everything has to be related to its source in one harmony, all the churches have to be united as one visible Catholic body. Well, how does the 9th century church maintain its unity? Well, now you've got both East and West saying that it's rooted in the charge that Christ gave to St. Peter, and which redounds to his lineal successors stationed in the Roman episcopate. And so now, in order for Cyprian's original idea to survive, we've got to fold it together with the high papal claims of Rome.
Right.
Because if we erase the high papal claims of Rome, what we have is a fractured church.
Right. You've basically undermined the basis upon which the church retains her unity in history.
Exactly. So in other words, Christianity starts to hop on one leg rather than stay on 2 feet. And so that's what I think it helps the whole doctrinal development debates, is that looking at how the graduations, like Augustine says, that heretics force the church to refine our teaching, and we end up understanding it better as a result of heretical contentions. But when you start to see those graduations, you begin to see, so this particular aspect may not have been as crystal clear before, but now it is crystal clear, because without this particular element, the church would have collapsed. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that is the way to chart the continuity, so that you're not just saying doctrinal development, doctrinal development, doctrinal development. You're actually showing, no, this needed to actually happen in order for the doctrine of the church to stay what it is. Cyril's Christology is an example of what development had to there's a certain development that had to happen in order for us to retain our worship of the one Christ.
Yeah.
That so there may have been different language in Cyril than you find in earlier writers. Athanasius is not as emphatic as Cyril is on certain things. But now we start to say things the way Cyril said it, because without that, we would have had a threat towards the worship of the God-man.
Would you apply the same mechanism by which you articulate doctrinal development to adjudicating the issue of the veneration of icons?
So this is actually a really tough topic. I've been sort of tapping into the debate a little bit here and there online. Dr. Gavin Ortland, as most people know, kind of set the stage, by saying that this is why he's a Protestant. There's a clear discontinuity between Nicaea II and the Apostles and the early Christians. So, that's why I can't be a Catholic. That's why I can't be Eastern Orthodox. And so you saw like all these responses to Ortland. Thus far, it seems to me most of the Catholics are responding with some kind of doctrinal development claim. Of course, you have some anti-intellectualist Orthodox authors whose names won't be mentioned, who have also tried to respond with basically saying, yes, what the bishops at Nicaea II said, what they were doing, what the 9th century Byzantine churches were doing, is what the apostles did. And so I think that it's a little bit of both. I do think that there was a culture of veneration, and I think that the Catholic Brothers is a YouTube channel. I think they've done a good job of trying to bring this back into history. So we do have there had to have been some kind of a tradition to venerate the saints and Christ through the Eucharist, the altar, the sign of the cross. I think is apostolic. All these things are substantially going to lead us into portrait veneration eventually. There's no way to really divide them, is what I'm saying.
Right.
The veneration of a toe that belonged to a martyr, that is basically what we're defending at Nicaea too, in substance and in some ways in form, you know, and in material, you could even say, because sometimes there was some sort of insignia associated with these relics to bring to mind the person. And I wrote an article on how this we already see this with Saint John Chrysostom with Saint Meletius of Antioch. He's already saying that they're drawing portrait images of him in order to venerate him and to remember him and his virtues. So I think that you have a little bit of both, a little bit of development, but you also have an active practice that is consubstantial
Yeah,
with
so you would
with
say
the
that the apostles kind of uh, established some baseline principles that in themselves can lead to the justification of the veneration of icons, but nonetheless were not realized at the time to lead to that conclusion.
So, look, it only helps me if the apostles on the day of Pentecost said, "Hey, after we baptized and confirmed and give communion, let's get all the painters in Jerusalem as well." It only helps me if that's true, but I don't see a lot of evidence that this was part of the normal spirituality of the Jerusalem church or the early
Well,
church
I
for
mean, I
that
don't see
matter.
why it would need to be. I mean, um, it also took a while for them uh, to erase or to abrogate the canon that you can't eat that you can't eat meat from strangled animals, right?
Right.
Um, so
Yeah, yeah. I think that I think Luke. I mean, if it was going to be something that the early Christians did as a matter of like, it was part and parcel with their spirituality, we would have heard something about icons at least in the earliest fathers. Um, the fact that all we have are, you know, things that we can date that are artifact, like old frescoes. We've got the catacombs and things like this. The dating those things is not as easy as people think it is. Oh, catacombs, definitely. That was done in had to have been done in the 70s and the 80s of the first century. Not necessarily. Um, there could these things could have been done later. I mean, we don't know exactly the dates of these things. In my opinion, I don't think they're as strong as confession of a particular person, especially somebody who is well to do to describe what early Christians did. So I just go by the fact that the earliest Christians are not talking about icons. I'll take that argument from silence as noteworthy. It's not something that is conclusive either way. But what I can't, like Origen, for example, or Clement of Alexandria, you'll find Clement saying things like, "Well, we don't worship with images and altars and things like that," right? But then in another book, he'll talk about the altar in the church. So in his mind, he's saying images and altars. He's thinking of something strictly the way pagans understand things. But then in another context, he could talk about the sacrifice of the church, which requires an altar, but he doesn't have a problem with it. So I think you could chart out a continuity. Um, and like you said, I don't think it's absolutely needed for portrait veneration to have been there by the apostles. But what I think the apostles had to have done is they developed this idea of incarnational veneration.
right,
And
And
Yeah.
that does seem to be established by virtue of the early veneration of relics, it seems to me.
Yes. Yeah. And I see it too. Itself will dovetail relic veneration and icon veneration, like
Yeah,
throughout the
I mean,
acts.
I don't see how they're really fundamentally distinct acts of veneration. I mean, they both require the use of some material object that is that is that does stand as the object of one's veneration. I mean,
And the person that's being venerated. Yeah.
yeah, the person being venerated specifically through these material vestiges that remain,
Yeah.
which
And a guy.
which cannot be and these material vestiges are in some way a signification of the person. They're not to be one-on-one conflated with the saint.
No, and see that's the key to this debate with the, as I see it progressing now with Dr. Gavin is, and the Protestants who take his view, is they see relic veneration and icon veneration as two entirely different things, and I think that the Catholic case or the Catholic defense of Nicaea II is really going to rest on the consubstantiality
Yeah, and
of relic
I would
veneration
argue
and
for
icon
that
veneration.
because it would be a fundamental and grave error to mistake a relic for the true and proper ultimate object of veneration that is accomplished through the relic. Like, the relic is not the saint. The relic
Right.
signifies the saint. There's a mode of signification that obtains between the relic and the saint. Just as, I mean, of course, we would recognize that there's, I guess, a more proximate and intimate relationship between the relic and the saint than between a an icon and the saint that it signifies. But it seems to me the crux of that of the matter that underlies their consubstantiality, as you say, is venerating a saint through a material object as signifying the saint.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the material object's mode of signification that is a that serves as an instrument of liturgical veneration.
Yeah, and even the early cases of relic veneration that you find in the 4th century, they'll even specify, we don't just do this with the relic, we'll do it with the tomb. We'll do it with we'll do it with the casket.
Right.
I'm thinking of St. John Chrysostom talks about how they venerated the
Yeah.
casket and
Yeah.
not just the
Right.
so yeah, your point on signification is well rooted in the
In both of these
doctrine.
cases, too, what happens seems to be essentially the same, which is the likeness of the saint is sort of contained within the material vestige that signifies the saint.
That's right.
That happens in a portrait as well. In a portrait, by virtue of the intentionality of the author,
Right.
the likeness of the saint and its signification of the saint is sort of contained in the portrait. I don't see a fundamental difference between veneration of a relic and veneration of an icon or a painting or a portrait or a statue for that matter, so long as we root the act in that in these common elements. And
Yeah.
I think there's good reason to root them in in those common elements.
That's the key. That's the key forward in the debate with Protestants right now in the blogosphere on the matter. It's also funny how this just goes along with what we've been talking overall on this whole issue of how does the church survive?
Right.
Because who do you have? You have the iconoclasts or the iconomachs, like
Yeah.
you have those, and then you have the iconophiles, or the people who iconophiles are the people who defended the veneration of images. So for a guy like Dr. Orland, with all due respect to him, he's an incredibly charitable person. He's a gentleman. I've had one-on-one discussions with him before.
Right. Yeah, of course.
He's a great person, but he doesn't have a party in the 7th, 8th, 9th century debates.
Exactly.
He doesn't even have a church he can go to. Because if you put him in those centuries, just his Mariology wouldn't allow him to go through the front door of any of the churches.
Right.
So this is we could look at this and say, all right, a Mariology that goes, this Protestant Mariology or evangelical Mariology, it entails the corruption of the church. And so the Mariology that began to inhabit the Catholic Church, small c, in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, that has to be a reflection of the will of Jesus. Otherwise, that bowling ball eventually hits the pin of Jesus' own words.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that a lot of these independent debates about these various issues, such as whether it be icon veneration or Mariology, it does
papacy.
It does kind of ultimately come down to this ecclesiological coherence that has to obtain through historical continuity.
Yeah, it's exactly. So the prophetic teaching of Jesus on ecclesiology demands the evidence thereof.
Yeah.
Jesus prophesied that the church would never be overcome by the gates of hell. So if you can find the church being overcome, breaking into, crystallized, invisible schisms that no one can discern the truth between any of them, that would be a practical dissolution of what Christ promised, and he wouldn't even be qualified to be a prophet according to the Old Testament anymore.
Yeah. It's true.
So this is what I'm saying. In order to keep the whole thing walking on 2 feet, in order to keep Christ's word true, if he's God, then what he said is true. In order to keep it going, you've got these developments that happen. You could trace out a continuity. Sometimes that continuity comes with competition, but you can put at one end of your pencil there and slowly start to trace it until you can finally darken the paper by putting more pressure down by these momentary graduations that come through heretical conflicts and questions and disputes. And in order for the line that you're drawing to maintain continuity, it has to undergo these graduations. And so, this is where I think the papacy comes into view, where we were talking about the ex cathedra thing and how that looks like a post ex facto manufactured engineering thing to avoid being checkmated. It actually becomes something necessary in order to keep the freaking thing walking on 2 feet. You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
now it's not
it's
now it's not just a lawyer thing anymore.
right.
Now it's how do we keep the words of Christ preserved?
Right, yeah, it's not so much trying to invent your way out of a conflict. It's more trying to say, okay, we can survey the historical development of the church, and then from that honest discernment of that historical development, we can arrive at, okay, what principles have to have to be established in order to make sense of that historical development in light of Christ's promise. And in order to do that, we can therefore come to a more refined articulation of, say, papal infallibility.
Right. Yes, and I think that they did that. I think that they did that at Vatican I because they understood where checkmate would be, and checkmate would be if the Roman pontiff faces the church and enforces on pain of exit, in other words, on pain of excommunication,
Yeah.
binding the church to an error that destroys the soul, that would be an internal combustion. That would be the supreme authority of the church basically dropping the dam and everything's gone. And so they knew that that could never be. You know, Bishop
Yeah.
Gasser spoke about this in his Relatio, where he spoke about how if the See of Peter became a See of Pestilence, that would be the demonstration of falsity to the whole system. And so the See of Peter had to maintain a certain kind of there's certain zones that the papacy can't go into. Otherwise, it starts to lead the ship, navigate the ship right into a to be capsized. So that was, I think that was true, because if it's if it's the case that the Pope is just always right, even if he's sitting at the dinner table and he makes a strong statement like the church believes such and such, he's talking to like 10 people at the dinner table, he can't be considered infallible there, because that would be it would betray the natural humanity. It would betray the natural course of practicality, rather.
Yeah.
For the Pope to he has a human nature that is fallible. We see this in Peter himself. We see this in the apostles themselves.
Right.
And yet we believe them and their peers wrote the New Testament. So, and yet those very writings show susceptibility to erring, and this is one of those anomalies in the New Testament not a lot of Catholics pick up on, but at the beginning of Galatians, Paul says, even if we come to you with a different gospel, let us be anathema.
Right.
Which is crazy, because it's like, wait a minute, Paul. So are you saying that when you first delivered the gospel, you were infallible, but now we're no longer to view you as infallible? But if that's the case, why were you infallible back then and not now?
Right.
But Paul is saying that I think he's speaking hyperbolically.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah, what I think he's saying, he is admitting that the first delivery, or whatever delivery he brings, is the standard. It is infallible. So that is the Catholic bishops had to figure out what it was. But you brought out something before that I think deserves attention, and that is there's this huge space between private person of the Pope and his full-blown ex cathedra teaching mode. So if you want to elaborate on that.
I have a theory on it that I've been kind of working toward, and it's in light of Michael Lofton's articulation of what he calls, and not just him, of course, this charism of safety doctrine, namely that we can have the same assurance that we have in the infallibility of the Roman pontiff when he speaks ex cathedra. We can have the same assurance in the general safety of the non-definitive magisterium of the Pope and the bishops, which is basically exercised whenever the Pope simply teaches to the whole church, not with the intention of binding the faithful absolutely to this doctrine. In other words, it's not an intention. It's not a manifest intention on part of the Pope to bind all the faithful to hold something definitively, but it is nevertheless an exercise of the Pope's teaching capacity, right?
Right.
And of course, we believe that, as is stated in the Profession of Faith, we believe that this organ of the Papal Magisterium is to be adhered to with religious submission of mind and will. However, most manualists will concede that this religious submission owed to this level of magisterial teaching is conditional. It's essentially a conditioned assent. However, that has not, in my view, been precisely the scope within which the assent owed to a non-definitive magisterial teaching can be withheld. That is an issue that I think has not really been developed very much, but certainly not by the magisterium itself, nor has it really been touched on very much by theologians. And for, I think, the obvious reason that the more that gets articulated, no authority wants to speak openly about like the scope within which his own authority can be, undermined.
Right.
So I think that's partially why we haven't had much theological discussion on that. But with regard to Michael Lofton's position, he would say that the same assurance that we have in the infallibility of the Pope and ex cathedra teachings, we could have that same assurance that this non-definitive organ of the magisterium will never even attempt to come out with something that contradicts something that has already been definitively taught. And that this is a charism of safety, so it's the protection of the Holy. It's by virtue of the protection of the Holy Spirit that this would never happen. Now, my problem with this is that I think like we talked a little bit earlier about the falsifiability of Catholicism. Mm-hmm. This, I think, raises that level of falsifiability like 100-fold in this day and age. Because we already have to tie ourselves into pretzels, I think, and I'm just trying to be honest, in trying to figure out how some of Francis's teachings cohere with the definitive teaching of the Church on some issues. Now, someone like Lofton, he will say, well, I've already done that. Like, I've already established that there's no contradiction whatsoever between a magisterial teaching from Pope Francis and what has already been definitively taught. You can watch my videos. It's like, okay. But, I mean, that you should at least acknowledge that it's very contentious that you've done that successfully. And
yeah,
you go ahead. I mean, I'll finish my point a little bit later, but I kind of want to have you chime in. So far.
So one of the things I'd like to say is that one of the things that Lofton is bringing out more and more is things that him and I have talked about in the past. One of the developments that took place in my own thinking is reflected in a number of articles I've written where I've called into question the relative ease that certain Catholics can have with attributing error to the Pope.
Right.
in any capacity. And I contrast this with some of the emphatic statements about papal primacy in the first millennium. So,
Yeah,
for example,
yeah, because those ones
the
are not
formula.
even nearly as refined and narrow as what we see in Vatican I. In some cases, I would argue that the earlier statements, like from Pope Agatho, are more seem to be
Exactly.
they seem to be less conservative than Vatican One in
Yes.
terms of yeah. But you go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, you have it exactly right. So the first millennium data on papal infallibility is actually far more general
Yeah.
and emphatic. So the formula of Hormisdas, for example, you've got the Chalcedonian crisis, right? You've got people questioning Chalcedon and all that, and then the Pope wants to reconcile the churches in the sixth century, and he says that Matthew 16 has this promise from Christ to Saint Peter, and that promise has been made true, or it's proven true because in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion always remains unsullied. And then he contrasts this with the pits of, like the mistakes of Alexandria,
Right.
the heretics of Constantinople, and the heretics of Alexandria and Antioch. So, presumably, not even presumably, quite clearly in the formula for Mizdas, he thinks that just an open sermon like Nestorius would constitute staining the see of Constantinople, whereas in Rome the see is untainted, right? So you get these kinds of statements throughout the first millennium, and the idea that you're getting from that is they believe that none of the occupants of the apostolic see can be heretics even.
Right.
That's the idea that you can get from that. So I want to say that because sometimes Catholics who haven't been reading much into history will criticize Lofton for some of the high. He really wants to preserve a high protection for the successor of Saint Peter.
Yeah.
And some people might think, oh, he's driven to do this because he loves Pope Francis or something like that, but he's actually driven by the historical evidence. But and this is where I don't actually agree with Lofton's position, although I respect it because
Yeah.
I think it deserves that. What we see in the first millennium side by side with these claims. In fact, you mentioned Pope Agatho, who says that the Apostolic See remains untainted and both in the past and forever unto the end. Right at that very council, they condemn Honorius,
Right.
and Pope Saint Leo II, who ratifies the council, ratifies the sentence against Honorius. Now people can go and look up my name on YouTube and Honorius to find out what I think about Honorius. I don't actually think he was really guilty of
Yeah, me
monothelitism.
either. But I mean that would be neither here nor there vis-a-vis
Right.
Agatho's claims, right?
Right. Yeah, because even if Honorius was flawless in his teaching, Saint Leo II would be in error for allowing the sentence of a pope on heresy.
Well, I
So
mean, one could say there that it doesn't really extend to that because that's a contingent factual matter. However, what it would do, I think, clearly, the one who he wasn't of the impression that Honorius was not guilty, so it kind of reflects a a way of thinking from the very people who make these generalized claims about the ineffectibility of the papacy, that even if Honorius is not guilty, they certainly thought he was guilty.
Right,
so
right,
so
and
that
and
reflects
and
their way of thinking about the papacy.
right, and as expansive as the Roman pontiffs have had been about their infallibility, I would say that it almost looks like they think they can't err in fact either when it relates to the faith. Not in the strict, indissoluble way that we see dogmatic facts,
Right.
but even in just, so Saint Leo II's ratification of the anathema of Honorius would be his agreement that the two letters to Sergius were erroneous. When in fact, if they're flawless, that would be it would be a clash between not it's not a formal error, of course. I'm not saying that, but it would be an error. It would be an error in fact, but an error in fact that would relate to the display of the faith in the letter to Sergius. So, but I think you're on track there. It shows how accept that a pope could err in faith. And I know that something that Michael often says is that, well, Honorius didn't write to the whole church. It was a letter from a patriarch to a patriarch. But and do you still have my audio, or
Yes.
did I? Okay,
Yes, I
cool.
got
I get scared with the technology
Yeah.
nowadays, but
Yeah.
the problem with that is that this dispute over the two operations, two energies, and the two wills, that was taken over the entire East, and Rome knew, because there was letters coming from Jerusalem. There were, he knew that there were debates coming from Egypt on the matter, Syria, and he also knew that the emperor was trying to make moves on the matter as well. So when he wrote this to the East, he didn't just, it's not like a patriarch to a patriarch, because, Pope Leo's tome was, in its original composition, a letter from a patriarch to a patriarch.
Yeah. Well, what that represents
but
is far more universal than.
yeah, and when Leo wanted his tome to be read by everybody, that was emphatic then that it was clearly, a universal teaching. But Honorius, we can't just belittle it to like a patriarch to a patriarch, like a private letter or something like that. I think it's more expansive than that. And if you look at the claims of Agatho, Hormisdas, people like that, they're definitely not working with this distinction between a letter from the Pope to the East versus a letter from the Pope to every church in the world. I don't even think there had been a letter from one church, from the Pope to the whole church.
Right. And well, it even I think we recognize that professions of faith are infallible, and yet usually those are prescribed directly to the people who need to be reconciled with the church. But we kind of
Right.
recognize that that profession of faith carries with it a universal intention. So, for example, like Innocent III's profession of faith to the Waldensians. Sure, I mean, you could look at that reductively and say that, oh, well, that's just to the Waldensians. And it just so happens that in that profession of faith, he says that the death penalty is in itself legitimate.
Right,
Kind of funny.
exactly. Exactly. So, like, if somebody would have came to Rome after Honorius wrote those letters to Sergius, and they said, "Oh, so what's Rome's position on this?" They would say, Honorius is not going to say, "Oh, well, I haven't really formulated a position vis-a-vis the whole church yet."
Right. He would
No,
say, "Well, okay, I've
he's
already
going to
done
say,
it."
I wrote 2 letters already. The copies are in the archives.
Yeah.
You know, um, so that distinction that Michael Lofton is making there, I think it's a legitimate one.
Yeah,
I
it certainly
respect
is.
it.
Like that distinction has definite applicability to many situations, right? Like, um, it's the basis upon which I would argue that the Pope giving a homily in the Basilica of St. John Lateran is not an exercise of his universal magisterium. It's kind of an exercise of his teaching authority as Bishop of Rome. So, I mean, these distinctions are very important. It's just we have to be careful about how we apply them, especially when we're applying them to, like, maybe anachronistically or if we're applying them to situations in history that just don't match up or align with the kind of categories that we use today.
Right. And the other thing is, at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, when they condemn Honorius's letters, they say explicitly that they are harmful to the soul.
Mm.
So in other words, those are the words they say. They don't. I'm not summarizing.
Right.
They literally say that the letters of Honorius are harmful to the soul. So it reflects that their understanding at the time is that a pope could teach something that, if believed, would harm the soul.
See, this is where, okay, now I can kind of go to how I would sort of deal with this charism of safety notion, because I do think that there's truth to it. In other words, and you might disagree with how I end up articulating this, but I think you have to modify significantly Lofton's position. You have to modify, but you also can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. How I would kind of see it is, I think that, first of all, I would sharply distinguish between the kind of like charism that protects the Pope from erring when he fulfills the criteria for an ex-cathedra teaching from whatever this charism of safety is for the non-divinity magisterium. I think this kind of charism of safety would have to be understood in a far more negative lens than the charism that protects him from erring in ex-cathedra teachings. Part of that is because for an ex-cathedra teaching to be exercised, all that has to obtain is that it fulfill the criteria that Vatican I outlined. So the Church is kind of saying there that whenever you see a papal teaching meet these criteria, we can be certain that the Holy Spirit protects it from any stain of error. And this is a charism, I think, in the true and proper sense. A charism of safety for the non-definitive magisterium is we would say that when the Pope truly does exercise an authoritative teaching, then we can kind of be assured that it will not harm the soul, or it will not contradict or bring about something that is materially heretical. What I would say is that what that articulation of these two categories allows for is the possibility, nevertheless, of a pope attempting an authoritative teaching, a merely authoritative teaching, but that because it's already, or it may already be overruled by the definitive magisterium, it sort of fails to meet a baseline criteria for being an authoritative teaching, because all a magisterial teaching is something that's authoritative. And so if it's kind of already overruled by the magisterium itself, I fail to see how that could qualify to be an authoritative teaching in the first place. Because it seems to me what the charism of safety qualifies is the basic integrity of authoritative teachings. But a teaching has to be authoritative first in order to be protected. Whereas for an ex-Catholic teaching, all that has to happen is that those criteria are met.
Right, because it's an unconditional assent at that point. You know, we don't have any right to. There's no recourse in that case.
And I'm qualifying my position further by saying that I think it still makes Catholicism falsifiable, because I think that what has to happen is for the authoritative magisterium to be an internally coherent organ of church teaching. And in order for that to happen, while I do say that the Pope can attempt a magisterial teaching that is already overruled by existing definitive magisterium, I do think that if the Pope attempts he charts new magisterial waters, so to speak, that hasn't really been touched on by the magisterium before, then we can kind of be assured that it won't contradict another rule of faith, because the magisterium hasn't even touched on the issue at all. So we can kind of be sure that it's the charism of safety will ensure that if a magisterial teaching is not already overruled, it will not be in contradiction to another infallible rule of faith other than the magisterium. So I do think it retains an element of falsifiability. I know that's something that someone might say, well, you're just kind of making it, you're just kind of setting it up ahead of time to be unfalsifiable.
Right.
But I may be rambling a little bit at this point. But I just think it's I think
no,
it's really
I know
important that we open ourselves up to the possibility of this actually happening, because it seems to me that if you hold an a priori position that this will just never happen in this day and age, I think you're kind of cornering yourself, and you're on very shaky ground.
Yeah, well, especially nowadays, right? Because with Pope Francis, you know, we can say that, you know, he has a great deal to say privately, which also colors the things he has said magisterially.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that
I think we're dealing with somebody who doesn't have in Pope Francis. I think I can safely say that we're dealing with somebody that doesn't have doctrinal orthodoxy as a pastoral priority.
No, and I've been candid about this when I was on Matt Fradd's show. You know, however long ago, I think it was early last year. I had described, you know, Fradd had asked me what I thought about Pope Francis, and what I said is that the best thing I can say about Pope Francis, he knows where the boundary of orthodoxy is. So just think of a circle, and the circumference is the outer boundary of orthodoxy. Everything within the circle is orthodoxy, and it's best to stay parked in the center. That's the best place to be. But what he does is he runs to the boundary, parks his feet right there at the boundary, and he wonders how he can kind of lean over to accommodate a certain element that he would consider, you know, disenfranchised, or the outcast, or people who are suffering and burdened, whatever it is. He leans, you know, because he's, you know, he tries to see how elastic the boundary can be. But then when people start blowing the whistle and referees start running out to the field, he can just take a close zoomed in picture of his toes,
Yeah.
which are right there on the boundary.
Yeah.
You know, and this is a problem for. I mean, if you have a baseball game where every batter hits a grounder right up the foul line, and they've got to call a timeout, they've got to look at the video, they've got to call New York, they've got to do all this stuff to figure out if it's a fair ball or not. That can make for a very bad baseball game. The first inning alone would be like an hour long.
Right.
You know, nobody. So obviously, that's just a silly example. What I'm trying to say here is that yes, Pope Francis has made doctrinal orthodoxy the last thing that he's concerned about. What he's concerned about is taking it to its longest elastic stretch in order to accommodate the needs of the people. And that's my best that I can give Pope Francis, which, you know, is kind of, I mean, you know, Lofton talks about how he defends the charges of error on the death penalty, Amoris Laetitia, and all these things. But even if it all checks out, you still have what I'm saying, which
Yeah.
which still is I would say injurious to the souls, because look at what has happened. You know, the Catholic Church has been in. I mean, Michael Lofton himself, it was a victim of the ambiguity of the church, as he expressed in his testimony on Matt Fradd's show.
Right.
That, you know, he was a victim. I think he was a victim. Today he might say he wasn't, that it was just his inability to interpret magisterial documents. But I still consider him a victim of the pontificate of Pope Francis. And so even if you have technical orthodoxy, I still think you can be a stumbling block to the church in ways that Pope Hormisdas would have never thought
Yeah. And
possible.
to me, it just puts you on shaky ground for the future. I mean, is it really going to be our position that it pertains to the indefectibility of the church, that going forward the magisterium will only as far as it will go, it will only like straddle that outermost edge of orthodoxy?
Right. No, that's
I mean, it just seems very flimsy. Whereas the theory I've kind of articulated can kind of allow for that to play out, while also kind of making sure that the center still holds, so to speak. And maybe I do that. Maybe my attempt to synthesize these things doesn't really pass the coherence test. I don't know. I mean, I've not really had this idea tested very much, but I do think that on the one hand, yeah, we do have to, I think, maintain that truly authoritative teachings of the church should always be sort of able to be adhered to without mortal sin. But the question is, what has to happen? Well, what are the requirements for an attempted papal teaching to truly be authoritative? Is it just the will of the Pope and that's it? Or do other criteria have to be met, such as, you know, not already being overruled by other either higher non-definitive magisterial teachings or certainly definitive magisterial teachings?
Yeah, and I you know, I understand. You know, we're already getting into you know, a field where even the first millennium would require us to get into, because, like I said, we spoke about Honorius, but what doesn't always get remembered is that he was that was rehearsed at the council of the Quinisex Council, the council in Trullo, 692.
Mm-hmm.
It was rehearsed at the Council of Nicaea, 787. It was rehearsed again at the pro-Roman Council against Photius in Constantinople, 869. And in there in particular, Pope Hadrian II addresses the Honorian issue,
Mm-hmm.
and he even says that, the Greeks condemned Honorius, which is interesting. He says the Greeks condemned Honorius, but in any case, he says, but that was a case of heresy, which inferiors have the right to dispute with their superiors.
Hmm.
So that's also an authoritative letter from Pope Hadrian to the council, which was intended to be read by everybody. So if we take Hormisdas and Agatho at their word, then Hadrian II has to be infallible in everything he says. But you get where I'm going here.
Yeah.
He's already saying that Honorius was legitimately repelled by the Greeks because of a theological error.
So it seems to me that what we have to do, and you've helped, I think, illustrate the necessity for this in light of history. What we have to do, therefore, is to come up with some kind of synthesis, because we have to reconcile what Agatho and Hormisdas say about the fact that the Roman See will always be undefiled, with sort of the tacit and explicit admission that Honorius, at the very least, attempted an authoritative teaching that happened to be heretical.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it seems to me these two things have to come together, and I would argue that they have to come together in allowing for the possibility of a pope to attempt a teaching that is already overruled and therefore fails to meet the baseline qualifications for being an authoritative teaching. So you retain the integrity of all authoritative teachings by just qualifying the conditions under which the conditions that have to be met for an authoritative teaching to happen. I mean, we already have conditions that have to be met for an ex cathedra teaching to be valid, right?
Right.
Why can't we theologically develop the conditions that would have to obtain for a pope to speak merely authoritatively as well?
Well, the Honorius situation would be slightly different, though, because then you don't have an authoritative teaching, before the whole issue of two wills, right? According to Catholic, the way we have developed our magisterial framework, there had been no conciliar teaching on the two wills yet. When Honorius wrote the two letters to Sergius.
So I guess why would he be condemned then?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. And one of my YouTube shows, I talk about how on contemporary Roman Catholic magisterial grounds, there was no legitimate anathema to Honorius. That's how it seems to me, because we have to the conditions are for heresy in the canon law, or you're contesting a matter that is required by all Christians to believe, right? And that's when it comes to a dogmatic status, or is revealed by some magisterial organ that it is de fide, divine revelation, or of secondary categories. And that really wasn't achieved by Honorius's time. But here's the thing: the people within the first millennium are not working with those conditions, and so we have to do a little bit of translating of what that could mean for today. Because we say that if Pope Francis teaches something that is erroneous, but we won't know if it's an erroneous for sure until 100 years from now. We come out with the Catholic Church puts a dogma out that shows that it was an error. Right? Well, we would say that that's not harmful, right? Because we don't believe that popes are going to be protected from error on matters like that. But see, the thing is, in the 7th century, they were talking about Honorius as a problem for souls.
Right.
So we can't just dispense with it because they're working with different conditions than we are.
Would it be because they felt it was somehow self-evident that at least their perception of what he allowed for contradicted another rule of faith?
Yeah, the patristic era. They're very much fundamentalist is the word that I'd like to use. Excuse me. They think the apostolic tradition is like crystal clear. And so when if a pope makes an error, they're not quibbling over whether it was an error
They're
after.
not trying to look for the benefit of the doubt. They're just kind of
No. The first time we see that is with excuse me, Anastasius the librarian, or Anastasius Bibliothecarius, in the 800s, who he defends Honorius because Maximus defends Honorius, which is another thing about we Eastern Orthodoxy that is interesting, because they condemn Honorius, his 2 letters, and everyone who agreed with Honorius.
Yeah.
At the Council of Constantinople 681. But for some reason, Maximus missed the swing. Maximus went to his dying breath agreeing with Honorius. But he didn't catch the wind of that anathema, even though, according to the council, he deserved it. Because they're thinking of whoever gives verbal adherence to these letters is condemned, So they're less careful in the early centuries about heresy and who deserves to be condemned,
Yeah.
But the point that I was trying to make is that where I was going was I was going to mention Vigilius, because he's the other case where we don't even need to debate about it. He himself admits that he erred in a universal decree. So this was the Constitution, the first Constitution that he wrote, which was he condemned the 3 chapters by condition, but he defended the letter of Ibas of Edessa to Marie the Persian. And that was the big issue, was this letter of Ibas. And he wrote the first Constitution using the Council of Chalcedon to say nobody can say that this letter is heretical. And if you do, you're basically excommunicated. Nobody has the authority to annul what I'm enacting right now through the authority of St. Peter. That's pretty powerful. I mean,
Yeah.
anybody who wants to read that, go ahead and pick up Richard Price's book on the Council of 553. But then 6 months later, he writes a second constitution, which basically says, hey, just like St. Augustine had his Retractionis, so also it is useful for souls to ponder their mistakes and to rectify them. And so here I am doing that. The letter of Ebos is a demonic, heretical, blasphemous doctrine.
So how would you reconcile that issue?
Yeah, so this is one of those issues, like you had asked me at the start. What are some issues that would be a challenge to Catholicism? And I think that this particular issue is the strongest argument that anybody, Protestant, Orthodox, whatever, has against Catholicism, because here you have a pope who issues a universal constitution, and so there the gun is the ammunition is put in, the gun is loaded, the trigger is basically pulled,
Yeah.
for papal infallibility, and so what comes out? Well, according to Vigilius, a blank. Because 6 months later, he comes out with the second constitution, saying that he was wrong. So this is in my book on the papacy, I raise the problem. I don't resolve it because it was too long. We had to lower the book from 1,000 pages to 800. So I had to remove an entire appendix out of the book, because on Vigilius, because of this. So I put it up on academia.edu. I wrote a few articles on Vigilius because of this issue. And I'm not entirely happy with what I've written so far. And so, I'm okay with that. Maybe there's somebody with a much higher IQ, such as yourself, that will sooner or later pick up this issue and take it to the next level. But right now, I just haven't resolved it fully. What I can say, excuse me, is that the first constitution, Vigilius, is 100% formally Orthodox. In other words, he's not an historian, he's not Eutychian, he's not anything but what the four ecumenical councils prior to him taught. He thinks that the letter of Ebos matches Orthodox Christology. So that's why he says whatever the Council of Chalcedon said about the letter of Ebos is irreformable. But 6 months later, what he learns is that the letter that he thought the Council of Chalcedon defended from Ebos is actually not the letter that was in question, and then condemns the letter that he formerly defended mistakenly. So in both constitutions, he has the same Christology, but he matched up this particular letter erroneously at one point, and then later changed his view about it.
So yeah, go ahead.
So, historically, for those who are deep in the know of magisterial disputes, this gets into the realm of dogmatic fact, and whether the Pope could be fallible when it comes to facts that are inextricably tied to his universal decrees.
Yeah, and I think I I don't think that the church has decided that dogmatic facts would have to be interpreted in such a way that would rule out fallibility in this case.
So, well, for me, it's a question as to whether the fact of the letter of Ebos is inextricable to the doctrine that Vigilius was pushing. I don't know. See, this is where I get a little bit lost. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube and you get real far, but you realize you're just not going to do it. So you set it aside. That's kind of how I feel about it. And I'm all right with that because you know why? That was in 553, right? If that was supposed to be game over for the papacy, then we should not have seen Saint Maximus's view in the next century, nor Pope Theodore, Pope Martin, Pope Agatho.
I mean, if all this comes down to just some, perhaps overexpansive view of dogmatic facts, I mean, that's
yeah. So it doesn't worry me a bit because whatever happened there with Vigilius in that constitutions in his two constitutions, it's very clear that the Holy Spirit continued to vivify the church towards the papacy. Look at Saint Maximus the Confessor and the Diothelite controversy with the Council of Lateran 649. All the other patriarchs went into monothelitism.
yeah.
And the Patriarch of Jerusalem was captive. The only person left at that point was the Bishop of Rome, right? And that might not sound like a big deal to some people, but here's why it is a big deal. Because that was the only church that was holding the line. Mm-hmm. So at that time, the Rome was making claims to infallibility, not just herself, but Maximus, Sophronius of Jerusalem, Stephen of Dor, the prime bishop of Jerusalem underneath Sophronius, the Synod of Lateran itself, which had a number of letters from Eastern folks, Maximus included with all of his monks. They're all claiming that the reason why Rome is upholding the faith is because of a divine promise of protection. That's significant because that's the last church standing, and if they're wrong about that,
then it's a total erasure.
That's right. So, so that's why the whole thing of Vigilius doesn't concern me too much because, I mean, this all goes back to Christ. Yeah. It all goes back to Christ. He rose from the dead. There's no doubt in my mind that he rose from the dead. And so what he said about the church, likewise, is consubstantial with the resurrection. And so what graduated from the 5th, 6th century into the 6th, 7th, and 8th, I know has the signature of the Holy Spirit, even if I can't figure out the Vigilian problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a healthy disposition to have. I mean, if we decided to jump ship after every puzzle, I mean, that would just reflect a very weakness in faith,
Yeah, and where would I jump to is the question.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I could jump. I mean, in my household, we talk about these things. Like my wife and I, we talk about this quite a bit. My son, he's 15. He goes to a G.K. Chesterton Academy, and his professors are, they're already introducing to him, some high-level philosophy. And as you know, it comes with some doom and gloom questions. I mean, we can go to, atheism, which is ridiculous. all those things are outruled, and like in Erick Ybarra's world, none of those are really like we've tried them. I've tried them in years ago. None of those things are really options for me. Agnosticism is not even there, but I do struggle sometimes with not having an answer to everything, and perhaps I'm wrong about everything. And what if I'm wrong about everything? Well, I it is depressing to think about, but I don't have a really good reason to believe that I need to be worried about it. Because even if that is true, my worrying about it is only going to make my temporary life a living hell.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, certainly that issue is very confusing. I mean, there are very intelligent minds on both sides of it. I just kind of interpret it as it's with respect to what the church teaches on, for example, dogmatic facts. There isn't really a definitive teaching on what precisely defines the parameters of how infallibility is applied to dogmatic facts. So it seems to me that this is another one of those issues that the solution to it seems to lie squarely within the realm of legitimate theologumenon for a Catholic.
And presumably even for a Gotho, right? Because that whole Vigilius thing happened in 552, 553, which was 130 years before a Gotho. So for some reason, Gotho, who can deny that he knew about what happened there?
Right. I mean, these are universal constitutions. I mean, clearly.
Right. So somehow he must have said, well, Vigilius is right about the substance of the issue. So yeah, he too didn't err, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
A dogmatic fact that seems to me would fall under like infallibility would be, like for example, like a pope's ratification of an ecumenical council kind of implies that all of the bishops at the ecumenical councils were real bishops, that they put forth these decrees in union with the Pope, not under some kind of duress, things like that, which I would say that they are dogmatic facts which are inextricably linked to the theological substance of the decree making sense, or serve as a basis for being true matter for an ex cathedra statement. Do you kind of see what I'm saying?
I do. I do see what you're saying, and I think that the whole the two constitutions of Vigilius, they're more of a problem of a recent creation than they are historically, because even when like the Greeks wanted to find problems later on, like during Photius's time, when they were trying to dig up problems with Rome, they never did with Vigilius. They only did it with Honorius.
Yeah.
So, there's that.
Yeah, and the Honorian issue is more, it seems to be more obvious because it does pertain seemingly to the actual issue at hand, like the actual theological issue at hand, at least was perceived because I mean some people would argue that that too is kind of an issue of dogmatic facts, but
right, yeah. So it's I like you said earlier, we're trying to like test our theories.
yeah.
Really, it's not our responsibility. This is the other thing you had asked. Like, well, I seem to be all right with holding some of these things in tension. Well, yes, because it's not my responsibility to really answer all this. Like, I think sometimes we as Catholics who are trying to evangelize or trying to defend the faith, we're trying to do all these things, we feel the pressure of having to reconcile all these things, and rightfully so. Like, we should try, but at the end of the day, it's in the lap of the magisterium to explain these things. And as far as I know, I don't see any rush to explain Vigilius. I wish they were. I wish there were some folks in Rome who
try
did.
to find. I'm sure a lot of cardinals wouldn't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so too. So.
I can't imagine someone like Cardinal Hollerich of Germany is thinking too much about Pope Vigilius or Pope Honorius.
No, and
Except
that's
to
sad.
justify maybe the possibility of departing from definitive teaching of the Church, but
yeah, no, I heard his answers to a certain interview, and he's a problem. I mean,
well, this is a guy who thinks that we can change the Church's teaching on homosexuality because the Bible teaches geocentrism.
Right.
I mean,
what he just did there was with a slick, he was very slick there. He's basically saying that you can change anything in the Bible, and that's I don't know how. I think he tried to clarify himself a couple of weeks later, but at this point, if he's got to clarify that, how do you clarify that?
Yeah, right. I mean,
You don't clarify that. You renounce that.
I mean, I wouldn't tolerate that opinion for like an 8th grade confirmation student, let alone.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So that's what gets to me at this point in time is that I'm not worried. I'm not too worried about like do I need to leave the Catholic Church to be Eastern Orthodox or a Protestant? At the same time, I can't deny what every eye can't deny.
Well, we have to have the humility to recognize, I think, that every system of thought has its limit cases. Every system of thought has its vulnerabilities and difficulties. And the question really is, which paradigm is able to minimize those limit cases or vulnerabilities or difficulties to the point where we can retain a sense of security in its basic coherence, which stands out as uniquely able to do this versus other paradigms. And we could say, well, this Pope Vigilius issue is confusing, so I mean, why don't we just become Orthodox? Well, I mean, I would argue that, and I think you've established throughout your professional career that the limit cases and vulnerabilities and theological difficulties and confusions are far more difficult to square in Orthodoxy than they are in Catholicism.
Well, yeah, and I just spoke to a gentleman in Europe earlier today who is really, really considering Eastern Orthodoxy. We spoke about, why I'm not Orthodox, and some people are shocked to hear that I actually think the debate over the procession of the Holy Spirit is actually a tad bit easier as a way to find a massive or a glaring problem within the coherence of Eastern Orthodoxy, with all due respect to my Orthodox friends and listeners. That and obviously the papacy's there, but it's of less clarity to me, because I think that the Orthodox have basically condemned through their official anathemas of the Filioque the Latin patristic heritage, and with that one of the wings of the plane is shot down, and then now you don't have Catholicism, nor do you have Orthodoxy. What you got is a spinning plane in midair. The only way to get back to homeostasis is to hold the Latin heritage and the Greek heritage in continuity and harmony with each other. And I think that's what they did at Florence.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Florence, that it seems like that's another one of those inflection points in church history where you kind of see that, like, again, that survivability principle that you illustrated earlier is kind of played out.
Exactly, because and we don't even need to use Latin voices, because it was the Greeks that were saying, Bessarion said this, Gregorius or Gennadius Scholarius said this too. They said if the Latin fathers contradict the Greek fathers, that would be the destruction of the Christian faith.
Yeah,
they said that. It's not like what's his name? The Dominican. I can't remember, the one who staged the floor with Ark of Ephesus. I can't remember his name, but it's not as if it came from him. It came from the Greeks. Right. They recognized that the Latin and Greek patristics had to cohere.
And this used to be far more of a problem for the East than it is for the West, because it seems to me that the Latin Church has taken far more, has taken more pains to accommodate the theology of the East than the East has taken to accommodate the theology of the West.
Yeah, theologically, absolutely. Theologically, yes. I think that I've shared this with like Eric Sammons on his show. I think liturgically, we're suffering in ways that Orthodox are not. And so in many ways, it's more visible. It's kind of like having a skin condition.
Yeah.
But if you've got a sword through the heart, by denying a biblical doctrine or denying divine revelation, your skin might be, clean as a baby's bottom.
Even liturgically, though, like I would argue that the Catholic Church, the main, I guess we could say, the ordinary state of the Roman Rite is something to be desired in terms of how, like, the Roman Rite is presented in ordinary parish churches. Nevertheless, the Church, I think, still holds up as sort of available and as living the fullness of the Church's liturgical patrimony, both East and West.
In a way, I agree.
In a way that the East, while there are, Western Rite Orthodox, I don't think it holds up the full breadth of the Church's liturgical patrimony as clearly as the West does. And in the West, while I would argue that, you could say that the older form of the Latin Roman Rite is certainly currently being a bit suppressed. Nevertheless, it's still like there, and it's on display, and everybody can see it. And you have the full availability of the Eastern rites in the Catholic Church. You have a wide variety of other Latin rites in the Catholic Church. So again, you have this care and concern on part of the Latin Church, on part of Rome, to keep fully intact both lungs of the church, both theologically and liturgically, and I just don't see,
I see
that
what you're saying.
concern really being as manifest in the East.
Yeah, from the angle you're speaking from, that I completely agree on that score. And I'm even okay with the Novus Ordo. You know, some people have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with it. I attend the Ordinariate.
Oh, you
and,
do?
Which
Okay.
is,
I mean, that's another thing. I mean, we also have the Ordinariate, which is
but it's really just the Roman Rite, the Anglican usage, of course. But I don't see anything indistinguishable like what Vatican II was looking for. I think most Ordinariate parishes are where it's at.
In my opinion, I would just have, like, I think the intentionality behind the liturgical reform that we got in 69, 70, I think it was motivated by pure intentions. I really do. However, I think that those missionary intentions that I think motivated the liturgical reform would be far better served if, say, the Ordinariate were kind of presented as that alternative to the missal of you could say maybe the 1962 missal. I mean, it seems to me that should be sort of the extraordinary and ordinary form. The ordinary form could just kind of be the Ordinariate. It has that missionary capacity within it to make the Mass more audible, understandable, intelligible, while also retaining those perennial elements of liturgy that I think we see are retaining their attractiveness. I think part of the issue with some of the liturgical reforms of 1970 were that they're kind of marked by an outdated zeitgeist, and what we're starting to see is people growing up in the afterglow of that zeitgeist and kind of realizing that there are perennial liturgical tendencies that have kind of been abandoned that stood the test of time for a reason.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm kind of rambling about this, and we've kind of gone on for a while. But
we've gone on. Yeah, we should probably wrap it up. We covered a large terrain. Spoke about a lot of things that probably don't normally get into with people, just because it's just a certain wavelength that people don't go to with these subjects. And I really appreciate you taking the time to allow the exchange. And our disagreements are probably very microscopic.
Oh yeah,
and so. But on the whole, just to wrap up the point I made about the Orthodox, I don't mean here to like attack the Orthodox here. I'm just if we're going to test a system.
Bob sent $4
theory,
for chat CT and Eric. I appreciate your work very much, Eric, and I'm going to order your book on the papacy tonight. I heard on Spexo's show that you believe in a young Earth. Could you expand on that, because it sounds pretty based on it.
I love the Orthodox. I love many of their traditions and everything. But there's not even a slight chance in my mind that if Catholicism is wrong, that I should become Orthodox, because I think that with the falsity of Catholicism comes as a corollary the lost hope of Orthodoxy being what it claims as well.
Would you also see in that like the falsity of Christianity?
So that's a good question. I don't know. I used to be quicker to answer that. I don't know. I'd really need to think more and more. Some people get upset about this, but I'm actually excited to get Dr. Gavin Orland's book when it comes out. He's writing a book on basically defending Protestantism. And I'm not, I've written books showing that Protestantism is false, clearly false. So I'm not the person who's like on the fence here about it, but I am intrigued by the efforts.
Yeah, I mean,
so yeah,
I think that to lose Catholicism loses. I think at the very least, like Nicene Christianity. I mean, I see them so inextricably linked, and I just can't interpret the words of Jesus apart from that promise of the church to endure. And I think you're of the same mind, but it is kind of interesting as the hypothetical question of what would even be retained.
Like my intellect would know. My intellect knows that it's not possible.
Yeah,
but I have this tantalizing like interest in hearing what somebody like Gavin Ortlund would say. I don't really expect to be swayed. And I know I'm probably not going to be swayed. I mean, it's a certain fact in my mind. But I just want to see what they do have to say about it. Because Gavin has really taken to heart some of the problems within Protestantism as well. We've been hearing all the apologias from guys like James White and John MacArthur and Ligonier and
that's
all these
all
people.
Gone
But
now to me, I
don't
think that has any retained relevance today. I think everybody can kind of see through. Just as I think people can see through, and no offense to these people, I think they're wonderful Catholics, but I think the era of Tim Staples, the era of like the old time Catholic answers, that's kind of gone as well. I mean, I think everybody is now trying to refine and sharpen their swords a bit, and that's a good thing.
And we couldn't have been here without those guys.
Anonymous sent $3. Hey, CT, it's your wife.
But
can I start dinner, or do you want me to wait until the end of stream?
We're moving
also,
on.
Start reading your chats so I don't have to resort to this means of communication.
Anyway, we should probably wrap up here. And I'd love to do this again sometime in the future. I think that would be great.
Yeah. I mean, we're basically done. We had just had a super chat before asking you. No, I honestly forget what it asked, but that's okay. I gotta tend to things.
Are these audio, video super chats? They can't type what they want.
Well, they type it and then it gets read.
Ooh,
like through TTS. Yeah. So
this is not on YouTube then. This is something else.
This is on an entirely different platform, actually. Yeah.
Wow.
But I'm gonna upload it to YouTube. Great. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, whoever sent in the super chat. Hopefully, we got to it somehow.
Oh
after
yeah, that's all right. That's okay. But I just gotta tend to things. I gotta go eat, as you've heard. So, I will. Hopefully, we can do this again sometime, Eric. I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah. It was a blast, brother. So take care, and until next time, you have a good evening, and we'll touch base on Twitter.
All right, sounds good. See ya. God bless.
All right, see ya. God bless.